Well, welcome everyone to this event sponsored by Christians Against Christian Nationalism. My name is Amanda Tyler. I am Executive Director of the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty, or BJC. Since July 2019, BJC has coordinated Christians Against Christian Nationalism. This project is strongly connected to our mission to advocate for faith freedom for all. And it's connected to our experience spanning 85 years now, working in coalition and in collaboration with others across lines of theological difference. We believe that for faith to be truly free, it must be freely chosen, not coerced, promoted, or denigrated by the government. Faith freedom includes the freedom to ascribe to any set of religious beliefs or to choose not to be religious at all. It also includes the freedom to act on those beliefs without unnecessary government interference. Under the US Constitution, that freedom is protected by creating a separation between religion and government that is good for both. It ensures that a multitude of religious faiths can flourish in a pluralistic and interfaith society and public square. If today's discussion stimulates your interest in broader issues on religious liberty in the courts, Congress, and our communities, we have a variety of resources on faith freedom for all on our website, bjconline.org. Nearly 2 years ago, we recognized a need for some common language to understand and call attention to a troubling ideology that was on the rise and that threatens religious freedom for all. We believe that Christians bear a special responsibility to understand and to root out Christian nationalism. And so, working with a number of other Christian leaders, we developed the Christians Against Christian Nationalism initiative, which can be found at christiansagainstchristiannationalism.org. On that website, you will find a number of resources to understand Christian nationalism. This open platform allows individual Christians from across the breadth of American Christianity to show their solidarity with principles of faith freedom. It also allows everyone access to resources to help understand how Christian nationalism threatens both our faith and our democracy. Our latest resource is this very program that you're participating in right now. The Most Reverend Michael Curry is the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church. The Reverend Elizabeth Eaton is the presiding bishop of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. Thank you so much, Presiding Bishop Curry and Presiding Bishop Eaton, for collaborating in this initiative, and I look forward to our conversation shortly. But first, we will hear from Andrew Whitehead. Andrew Whitehead is the Associate Professor of Sociology at Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis. And now I will turn it over to Professor Whitehead.
So a number of weeks ago, January 6th, we saw some really incredible images that in many ways were so shocking. And so if we can move to the next slide. And while they were shocking to see the violent insurrection at the Capitol, in many ways they weren't necessarily surprising to those of us that have been following along or tracking with Christian nationalism and studying it in the United States. So in order to make sense of this riot, while Christian nationalism is not the only explanation, it is a key part of understanding what took place. So the big question is, what is Christian nationalism and how do we measure it? So we define Christian nationalism as a cultural framework. And this cultural framework idealizes and advocates for a fusion of Christianity with American civic life. It also includes, though, this idea of Christianity, assumptions about nativism, white supremacy, patriarchy, authoritarianism, and militarism. So the Christianity and Christian nationalism to a certain population means people like us. And the people like us are generally white, native-born, and culturally Christian. So it's a cultural package. Now, one thing that many ask is, how is Christian nationalism different from civil religion? And this is a great question. So to just touch on it quickly, Civil religion pulls also from religious influences, but from more of a prophetic Old Testament tradition, where they talk about perhaps providence or a creator God that demands justice and humility and public service. And so when we talk about civil religion, we're talking about a civic republicanism that emphasizes strong civic virtue. And this was something that, yes, at the founding of the United States and through our history, many leaders have encouraged. But Christian nationalism is something different. It demands a tribal loyalty of sorts. It is an identity marker. And so it draws on a separate Old Testament tradition, it seems, one of violently defending the group and the tribe against outside influences. It's about subduing others. It's about waging wars, and many times cultural wars, for good. It wants to define the us against a them in all manners. So how do we measure Christian nationalism? Well, in our work, when we survey large portions of the population, we ask usually 5 or 6 questions of our respondents, things that ask them to strongly disagree, to strongly agree with statements like the federal government should advocate Christian values. The federal government should declare the United States a Christian nation. That we should allow prayer in public schools, or that the United States, the success of the United States, is part of God's plan. To the left are rejectors. And so they're about 22% of the population, the white bar. So these are Americans who completely repudiate any notion of a close relationship between Christianity and American civil society. Resistors are the blue bar, and they're about 27% of the population. They're uncomfortable with the idea of a Christian nation, but they're more undecided than our rejectors. So they are not wholly opposed, we would say, but they definitely lean toward opposition. And in the gray bar, about 32% of the population, this is the largest of the 4 different orientations towards Christian nationalism, we have accommodators. Now, accommodators are in some sense a mirror image of resistors. So they lean towards accepting the Christian nation narrative, this cultural framework. They're friendly towards it. So their support is undeniable, but it isn't comprehensive. And finally, we have what we call ambassadors, the red bar there on the right. And they are just under 20% of the population, a fifth of Americans in the US. And they are wholly supportive of Christian nationalism as a framework. So believing that the US either was or still is, or at least at the very least should be, a distinctly Christian nation in order to flourish. And again, the Christian brings with it a host of different cultural assumptions. If we look at these different responses towards Christian nationalism, on this next slide, you can see we asked a question, what percent, and we show here of white and Black Americans, believe that Black Americans face a lot, in quotes, of discrimination. So you can see that the white bars are white Americans, and then the blue bar are Black Americans. And across our 4 orientations towards Christian nationalism, there are a couple of trends that become readily apparent. The first is with the white bars, they go down significantly from one to the next. So only 10, 11% of ambassadors think that Blacks face a lot of discrimination among white Americans who are ambassadors believe this. But when we look at rejectors, many more agree that there's a lot of discrimination. But if we look at Black Americans, no matter how strongly they embrace Christian nationalism, there really is no difference in these groups. So they believe, in spite of, and for these Black Americans who are ambassadors, believing that the US is a Christian nation, they still believe that Blacks face a lot of discrimination. So this should tell us something. Christian nationalism for white Americans, in many ways, blinds them, or is part of helping them blind themselves to believing that there is inequality in the US and that Black Americans face discrimination. So if we think back to the numbers of people within religious traditions that embrace Christian nationalism to some extent, you can see how focusing on racial justice would be difficult with that cultural framework in place. And then the next slide, we ask if they believe police reports of brutality towards Black Americans are exaggerated by the media. Here again, for white Americans, the more strongly they embrace Christian nationalism, the more likely they are to agree that these reports of police brutality are exaggerated. But for Black Americans, again, no difference. And so Christian nationalism not only influences how white Americans think of racial inequality in America, but it operates differently among racial groups. So really quickly, in conclusion, we can see that Christian nationalism is pervasive across all segments of US society, within different religious traditions as well. And it's influential in shaping Americans' behaviors and attitudes. So we talked about racial justice, but we have work looking at COVID-19 behaviors about what people do and also government restrictions. When we talk about immigration, or especially religious freedom, something the BJC cares about, we see Christian nationalism as key. So it is absolutely a threat to a pluralistic democratic society, and something that needs to be wrestled with in order to move forward and not repeat the events of January 6th. So thank you, and look forward to the continued conversation.
Thank you so much, Professor Whitehead. Now I'm going to bring into this conversation Bishop Curry and Bishop Eaton. Could you both name some of the theological problems with Christian nationalism narratives? In the church and in the public, we have a broad spectrum of theological perspectives on religion. So I'm not asking either of you to speak on behalf of all Christians, but from your position, what are some of the most basic theological flaws with Christian nationalism?
Since the beginning of the Christian movement, one of the earliest confessions of faith was Jesus is Lord, which was seen as a direct threat to, at that time, the Roman Empire and the emperors, a threat to the state. And Christians faced persecution because they declared that their primary allegiance was not to any temporal or secular government, but it was to the Lord. So that's a primary problem in all this. And for Lutherans, all of you get out your small catechisms and look up Luther's explanation of the first and second commandments. It's a perversion of how we understand that we're in fact citizens with the saints and not citizens primarily or ultimately of any one temporal government.
Bishop Curry, what would you add to that?
No, I'd want to affirm and amen that. If you look at the history of Christianity, when it has gone astray, whether it is in support of slavery or silence in the midst of evil against any people, the suppression of people, injustices, there's a consistent pattern that Jesus of Nazareth, his actual his teachings, his example, his spirit, the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 25, the parable of the sheep and goats, the Good Samaritan, that Jesus of Nazareth gets moved aside and suppressed for a broad, ambiguous Christ figure who can be adapted to any cultural context or adapted to anybody's whims. And so it is this Jesus of Nazareth, this Jesus, as Bishop Eaton has said, Christ as Lord, not Caesar. When that Jesus Christ is compromised, we're going to find danger. It is danger Will Robinson at that point. And you see it in Christian nationalism. You've seen it in all the isms where Christianity, whether it has been theological ways of being comfortable with apartheid, whether it was in the Nazi church, whether it has been in white supremacist Christianity, you name it. Every time the Jesus of the Sermon on the Mount, the Jesus of the parable of the Good Samaritan, the Jesus who says you shall love the Lord your God and your neighbor as yourself, on these two hang all the law and the prophets, that Jesus gets suppressed and put aside. So it is a violation of Christianity based on Jesus Christ as Lord from the very beginning. And that begins all sorts of trouble.
Well, and you both point out just how foundational, what a threat this is to the very foundation of our faith. And I think Professor Whitehead showed just how pervasive Christian nationalism is in our culture. And so I'm curious to hear where you see Christian nationalism to be the most prevalent from your perspectives as religious leaders. Where do you see Christian nationalism showing up?
Well, I think it's very important to understand that we are not condemning being patriotic. That's different. Christian nationalism conflates our allegiance and our understanding, even our relationship with God, with a particular secular state, in the case of the United States, to be a Christian country. And so you cannot by that definition, be a real American unless you're a certain kind of Christian. And for us, for Lutherans, we number our commandments different. So for us, the second commandment is that you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. And Luther said that that this kind of thing of appropriating this is, he said, see, all of this is an attempt to deck yourself out with God's name or put up a good front and justify yourself, my emphasis, or your cause with God's name. And we see that with folks. It's different from patriotism, but when our allegiance is first, and our identity and meaning is caught up in Christian nationalism and not in God, then that's a problem. And we can slip into that very easily. We see this in time of warfare, in time of crisis, and certainly we're in a crisis now.
Yeah, I have to say that I suppose there are innocent forms of Christian nationalism and less innocent forms of it. But I grew up in the Black church. I'm an Episcopalian, been an Episcopalian all my life, but I grew up in a Black Episcopal church. And in my congregation when I was a kid, I remember it was a mixed congregation of Blacks from the West Indies and Blacks from America, but it was a Black congregation. And I vaguely remember some dispute in the early 60s about the flag, because the Union Jack was in the church as well. And I'm guessing that there was a controversy among the those from the West Indies and Americans. Anyway, the compromise was that both the American flag and the Union Jack were both kind of put up on a balcony, so you can see they weren't up front near where the altar was. And I'm guessing that was the compromise. Now, again, that's kind of a nationalism. I mean, but it's more it's more cultural heritage, which is a kind of national. That's probably fairly innocent, if you will. There's the more virulent or dangerous kind that sees my nation, whatever it happens to be, we're number one because we're God's favorites. We're number one. You see what I mean? And that borders on blasphemy, idolatry. I am the Lord thy God. Thou shalt have no other gods but me. Whatever the correct number is, that's in the 10 Commandments. And that kind of nationalism is dangerous. It is dangerous to civic health. It is dangerous to the health of Christianity. And it is dangerous to humanity, because when it gets going, it means if we're God's favorite and we're the chosen ones and we're in charge, then everybody else is secondary. And that leads to all sorts of, and we've seen that. So Black folk, even if they hold that nationalism, it's probably more an innocent Christian nationalism, because they've seen the danger of Christianity and white supremacy conflated, and they know it when they see it. I think there are other people who have the same discernment because of their experience that leads them to discern the difference between the kind of Christian nationalism that becomes very dangerous quickly, and the kind that, while it's problematic, is probably more innocent. We've seen the dangerous kind. I'm just gonna say it. I have always known, I'm 67 years old, been Black all those 67 years. And I have known since I was a childhood that the Klan professed to be Christian. That Nazis in this country professed to be Christian. We grew up knowing that. So we knew there was an unholy conflation of Christianity and white supremacy, and it was often tinged with Americanism. We knew that. Dr. King articulated the ideals of America, not that kind of, but the ideals of an America where there is liberty and justice for all, and the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth and the aspirations of the human soul. That's not Christian nationalism. That's a kind of civic religion, if you will, that is legitimate. It lifts people up. It sets people free. And that is consistent with Christianity. The other is not.
I have a colleague who said to me that he sees it that when the church gathers, that gathered community is an embassy for the kingdom of God, which can be never confused or identified with any other earthly nation, state, ruler, or political party.
I'm just wondering how you see Christian nationalism and white supremacy merging in some cases, and in our project, Christians Against Christian Nationalism, we talk about Christian nationalism providing cover for white supremacy and racial subjugation. But I wonder how you all see that, and how important it is to fight Christian nationalism as we also fight to dismantle racism.
Well, 100 years before the first enslaved Africans were brought to the shores of Virginia, land was taken based on the doctrine of discovery. And in that doctrine of discovery, issued by the Pope in that century, it was essentially that if you weren't Christian, you really weren't a person. And so if you were in areas of land where there weren't Christians, that land was now available for the Christians, the Spanish, the French, and the English to take over, because these weren't people. And so from the very beginning, the notion of white supremacy, superiority, has been part of how this country, before we were in a country, that was part of the myth. And then certainly, I think the Bible has always been used by right and left to justify their causes. But if you take some look at the justification for slavery, Scripture was freely used, and I think perverted in that way.
Yeah, there was where you can see it, and this is an example from the Anglican tradition. So I'll expose one of our sins. There was a great debate among slave owners, many of whom in colonial America were Anglicans, Church of England, folk from England. And there was a debate: should they baptize their slaves? Should they catechize them, teach them about Christianity, and should they baptize them? And so the question was, the Bishop of London had charge over the Anglican churches in the colonies at the time. And so he was asked about this, and he wrote back, and he solved it by saying that baptism is wholly a spiritual matter and has no effect on a person's civil standing. Well, that was a lie. That was a moment when white supremacy coalesced with a theology interpreting what Paul said in Galatians 3, what Jesus had talked about over and over again, and clearly reinterpreting it for political and economic purposes. That's where white supremacy, and that's a perfect example at the origin of Christianity coming into America. It's a lie. He knew it when he said it. It was a lie. Paul said, all who have been baptized into Christ have put on Christ. There is therefore no more male or female, slave or free, Jew or Gentile. Now you can equivocate and you can segment that all you want. Paul meant what he said. And I know folk have issues with Paul, but that's all right. My grandma said Paul was like every preacher. He had some good sermons, he had some bad sermons. Problem is, they're just all in the Bible. But he was right on that one. And Christianity is, like Bishop said, was distorted to accommodate to the cultural desires. That's perversion. It's a clear perversion, and it is contrary. I keep going back to Jesus of Nazareth. See, there needs to be some standard of what a Christian or what Christianity looks like, and it's Jesus of Nazareth. It's Jesus the Christ. Mm-hmm. As Bishop Eaton said earlier, Jesus is Lord. None of us are.
Why is it so important for us to be speaking out against Christian nationalism now? What lessons can we learn from history?
Well, we've seen in the last 4 years, and perhaps even a little bit before that, a rise in anti-Muslim bigotry and anti-Semitism. And we've seen horrific, particularly in Pittsburgh at the Tree of Life Synagogue, the largest single massacre of Jewish people in the United States. And also with our colleagues in Islamic Muslim colleagues, that they're facing vandalism and persecution. And one of the tenets of Christian nationalism is you have to be Christian in order to be an American. And on their own website, they say that Islam is a perversion of the Judeo-Christian message, and that it is a threat to the United States. That's a very short step to taking torching synagogues and mosques and murdering people.
Remember Dr. King said, darkness cannot cast out darkness, only light can do that. Hatred cannot cast out hatred, only love can do that. we must counter this negative perversions of Christianity and of our humanity. We must counter them with an affirmative, positive way of being Christian. One, I do think Christianity must recenter itself on the teachings, the example, and the spirit of Jesus of Nazareth. I just think that I think that is critical. And I mean the New Testament Jesus, the one in the book, right? I mean, I'm not playing with cultural ones, not complicated, the one in the book. And I think I think this is work of positive, affirmative evangelism that grounds itself on Jesus of Nazareth and his teachings. That's one. I think the second thing is, I think we do have to call on affirmatively our common humanity, that we are all children of God, made in God's image and likeness. And that means we're brothers, sisters, we are related to each other. And then thirdly, I think we have to rebuild, and this is where it gets practical. We have to rebuild relationships between people across difference of politics, across difference of race, across difference of religion, and we have to do it intentionally. I've been inviting Episcopalians, and they've been hearing, I say, from many one, we must become e pluribus unum, and we must reach out to people who are different than we are to cultivate at least relationships across difference. And we have to do that affirmatively and intentionally and across I mean, that's one very practical thing. Everybody who knows somebody who's different than they are, get to know them. Spend some time with them. Let that become a personal value for your life. And then maybe we can begin to chip away.
Great. So with our remaining time, we have had quite a few questions. A question that came from several different people in slightly different wording. You know, how do we go about reclaiming a version of Christianity that is more in line with how we read and understand the Gospels and the message of Jesus?
We face this on a regular basis. Evangelical is the name of our church. So we're the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, which is Greek for the good news. And that was the way that churches of the Reformation were identified in Europe and identified in many places around the world right now. This is the Evangelical Church. But we know that when we say that we're the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, people think of, I think, an unfortunate cultural understanding of what evangelical means. And I think you're right about Christianity. My daughter and son-in-law, when they lived here in Chicago, had neighbors and who were older than they were, and they knew that, they knew what I did, and they knew the kids were very active in their church. And one of the neighbors said, well, how can you tell me about this? I don't get it. Christians are anti-intellectual. We're anti-science. We're judgmental. We discriminate against people. We're anti-LGBTQIA folks. And so that's out there. That's just in the ether. So we need to say, no, that's, let me tell you about how we understand God, how we understand a God who means well for us. A God who is not distant, but became one of us in the flesh. A God who, as one of our bishops said, quoting the Apostles' Creed, went to hell and back for us. And for all people, even those who are not confessing Jesus as Lord, this is for everyone. And, Lutherans talk a lot about grace. I think it's time for us to understand it and live it. God's grace is for everyone, not just for certain people.
Mm-hmm. We as Christian people must stand with those who have nobody to stand with them. And therefore, we must speak up and show up when something happens against our Jewish brothers and sisters, against our Muslim, our Sikh brothers and sisters. We must stand in solidarity with them. We must stand publicly for things that don't give us any advantage. That is to be spokespersons for children in this society who are hungry right now, to advocate in the public sphere for what is just and kind and decent and humane. And so we have got to shift the face of Christianity. People have got to see it before they'll believe it. Folk have got to see a different version of Christianity. And then maybe we can reclaim this faith.
A little in the same line here, it was a question that said, considering that people who are, I guess, ambassadors of Christian nationalism, the ones who embrace Christian nationalism the most, see themselves as doing God's work by imposing what they see as God's will, What can the church do to counter that?
That could be someone's sincere beliefs, but usually it seems to me, and Lincoln spoke against this, that we have God on our side. And that's always dangerous when human beings decide they have God on their side, as opposed to us trying to be on the side of God.
Well, our time is gone. This has just flown by, and I just thank all three of you so much for joining us. I want to say a special thanks to the BJC staff team for all of their work to pull together today's event. And in closing, I would just encourage you all to go to christiansagainstchristiannationalism.org for the latest resources on the topic. We are continuing to update the website. If you have not signed the statement yet, I hope you will review it and join us, and then share the statement with others in your community, asking them to join, and also just using the language to help start the conversations, to help really engage on this topic. So thank you all for being here.
Tell people about this barnstorming tour that Michael Flynn is on, its appeals and its appeal to the people who come there.
So we documented Flynn on traveling the country. He's actually had more than 60 events since January 6th. His premier event is called the Reawaken America Tour. It started in the spring of 2021. It's now had 16 stops. It's generally a couple days long. Oftentimes it's in a church, and it has dozens of speakers. Flynn is the headliner, but there are people like Roger Stone, and it mixes religion and conspiracy theory and politics all together. I attended for 2 days one of these tours in Western New York, and at the culmination of one of the days, they invited people to be baptized at the end of the day. Another aspect of this is that in these Christian spaces, as we have been told from people who study them, there is a high regard for members of the military. There's a lot of mixing of these ideas of military. One woman we saw at one event, she was wearing a t-shirt, Army of God. And he kind of brings all those things together into one package, Michael Flynn.
You've spent over a year covering Michael Flynn, preparing this documentary. And in recent months, we saw videotape of Michael Flynn's testimony to the January 6th committee become public.
Do you believe the violence on January 6th was justified morally?
Take the fifth.
You believe the violence on January 6th was justified legally?
Fifth.
General Flynn, do you believe in the peaceful transition of power in the United States of America?
The fifth.
We spoke with more than 125 people for this film, and that was a shocking moment to them, that a three-star general who was once the national security advisor to the president would plead the fifth to a basic fundamental part of our democracy.
They're going to shut our churches down, and they're going to tell you, you're going to get mandated to do this, you're going to get mandated to do that. God bless you, God bless America, and thank you very much. Peace.
Denver Riggleman's team analyzed a vast amount of call data and messages from January 6th. He told us that those themes rose to the top.
This idea that this was spiritual warfare, it's not even an undertone. It was almost right out and hit you in the face that this was religious warfare. And really that is the baseline of this, is this good against evil apocalyptic message.
Jesus Christ, we invoke your name. Amen.
I think a lot of these belief systems are baked in, but you still have New World Order, global cabals, groomers, all the stuff that goes back to the protocols of the Elders of Zion and blood libel, and just keep on going, right?
The vision of Christian nationalism is that we need to take the country back for Christian priorities, Christian values. We need to make America Christian again.
Professor Samuel Perry has written extensively about the ideology known as Christian nationalism and the threat it poses to democracy.
My parents are evangelicals. I went to a flagship evangelical seminary training to be a minister. I would, in many ways, describe myself as an evangelical. I'm very much speaking and writing to my people. Mike Flynn has emerged as a martyr and a mascot for the far-right contingent of the Christian nationalist movement in the United States.
I got to put, somebody sent me a thing this morning where they're talking about putting the vaccine into salad dressing or salads. Have you seen this?
Yes.
Have you seen this? I'm thinking to myself, this is the bizarro world, right? This is definitely the bizarro world. And they're talking about the United States of America. Talking about the United States of America, because when Matthew mentioned it in the Bible, he wasn't talking about the physical ground that he was on. He was talking about something in the distance. So if we are going to have one nation under God, which we must, we have to have one religion, one nation under God and one religion under God, right? All of us together, working together.
We need to be the party of nationalism, and I'm a Christian, and I say it proudly. We should be Christian nationalists.
The church is supposed to direct the government. The government is not supposed to direct the church. That is not how our founding fathers intended it. And I'm tired of this separation of church and state junk.
But what exactly is Christian nationalism? According to Christianity Today, it is a mass movement that believes the American nation is defined by being Christian and the government should keep it that way. But which Christianity are Christian nationalists actually talking about? It's not the love thy neighbor kind. After all, many scholars like Kelly J. Baker argue that the most dedicated Christian nationalists in America a century ago were the members of the Ku Klux Klan, who also marched on Congress in hopes of reclaiming the country for their white Christian vision. In fact, the preacher who launched the Christian nationalist crusade back in the 1940s, Gerald L.K. Smith, was a conspiracy-spouting anti-Semite. He also founded the pro-Nazi America First Party and challenged FDR in the 1944 election, claiming the president had Jewish ancestry. Now, with a pedigree like that, you'd think politicians today would shy away from the term and all it entails. But they're not. More politicians are publicly embracing a kind of muscular and mainly white Christianity that is defined by its politics. Some of these faithful are even building patriot churches where parishioners pray that, quote, communism and socialism and transgenderism and homosexuality and abortion will not have their way in this land. And they're getting elevated in Republican politics, like Doug Mastriano, the GOP nominee for Pennsylvania governor, a 2020 election denier who participated in a series of Christian marches in Washington in the lead up to January the 6th. Now, Mastriano is taking heat for his close relationship with Andrew Torba, the CEO of the right-wing social media site Gab, who this week renewed his calls for an exclusively Christian nationalist conservative movement.
So, no, we don't want people who are atheists. We don't want people who are Jewish. This is an explicitly Christian movement because this is an explicitly Christian country. Now, we're not saying that we're going to deport all these people or whatever. You're free to stay here, right? You're not going to be forced to convert or anything like this, but you're going to enjoy the fruits of living in a Christian society under Christian laws.
The fruits of a Christian society, a very particular kind of Christian society.